My name is William Munn, and I am a freelance RPG writer and producer, and I am currently co-producing Zorro, the role-playing game, which is crowdfunding right now. We funded like a couple weeks ago, and we're unlocking stretch goals, so it's on Kickstarter.
Congratulations.
And thank you. And let's see. Other than that, yeah. I'm not going to talk about anything else. I will have another thing later, maybe. Let's go to Daniel.
Okay, I'm Dan Yocom. I write Guildmaster Gaming, which is based for supporting tabletop gaming of all types. I also do game reviews. I do book reviews, movie reviews, anything else for geek. Some of the different things I've done, other than that, is I have done some short stories. I have one in here, horror, if you like horror. And I used to write game reviews for other sites and magazines and so forth.
Cool. Marion?
I'm Marion G. Harmon. I first became a published writer with 2011 with Wearing the Cape, which was the first of the series. About 7 books in, I decided to scratch my itch and did the Wearing the Cape, the role-playing game, which is why I'm here on the panel, I guess, because this was a successful Kickstarter campaign back in 2016. And it's probably going to have a follow-up campaign any time now. So,
Awesome.
Yes.
That's really cool.
And Laura?
So my name's Laura Palmer. I write a series called The Pickington Tales. It's like if you took the setting of Downton Abbey and Once Upon a Time and put it together. I'm also excellent at being a nerd and playing games and enjoying role-playing games. But also one of the things I'm working toward is doing a rebrand of my books, which has a similar process of that. I've also have some close friends of mine that I've helped do some of the publicity and things for their crowdfunding campaigns, and they've been successful because they know how to hustle.
Awesome. All right. So I'll go through and I'll ask some questions. We'll probably have time for questions at the end from those of you who are here in the audience. But I think I'd like to start out, if I could. Let's just kind of get this on the table because there are platforms for crowdfunding, right? Crowdfunding is something that generally gets done online. But maybe could we talk about what different platforms there are for crowdfunding and why you might use some of them? You want to start with
from left
Daniel
to
and
right?
go
Sure.
that way, and then we'll...
I'm probably the weak link when it comes to this part. I have been involved in helping people do crowdfunding in terms of writing articles and reviews and so forth of material before they've actually gotten out there. The only one I really know about, I know there's GoFundMe and there's Kickstarter, but I haven't really been involved in that level of actually running the campaigns on that. So in terms of saying what's out there, I'm not sure. I can also say, along with games that I have done this for movies also, which is a whole different aspect of how to go about it. But yeah.
I don't have much to add to that. Really, my sole experience so far has been on Kickstarter. GoFundMe is a similar platform, although they do have a few issues with them there. They also have supporting sites like BackerKit, for example, that heterodyne on the top of those. So people might, if you're looking for a platform, it really depends on what you're trying to do. I mean, Kickstarter can do anything from basic to nearly $1 million campaigns. Just be aware of everything that's involved before you go in. So.
Yeah, crowdfunding is not for the faint-hearted.
No.
And so I think Patreon is kind of a form of that. It's a little bit different than how Kickstarter is because it's more long-term. On the music scene, there's pledge music. You can find ones that are specific to a type of media or type of things like that. I know there's a couple that are trying to do specifically books and things like that. But Kickstarter, I think, is still the biggest one, and I think has the largest community that's just looking for cool stuff. And that's why I think Kickstarter is kind of there's a social media aspect to Kickstarter that helps people find whatever your project is. And I think that's the big benefit of Kickstarter.
I do know there is a large community on Kickstarter just for games.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Very large.
So is it fair to say that some of the marketing that you get by using Kickstarter is a benefit to actually choosing that as a platform?
Yeah. I think you got to be smart about what platform you use and know who's looking at it, who the audience is, and how they're going to connect to that.
Okay. I know there are some, you mentioned Patreon, I know there are some game companies that are doing Patreons that are producing games off of Patreons, right? And I think that's a valid way to do probably smaller productions. But if you're going to do something like these books that Marion has here, right, that's a lot of work, and I think it would be really difficult to raise the money you need on a Patreon for something like that.
Patreon's better for small amounts of money over time.
Right. Indiegogo, another one that I found, and you mentioned like BackerKit or different survey things that help you figure out the fulfillment aspect of a Kickstarter. There's another one that, who knows Torg? Anybody played Torg?
The role-playing game?
Yeah,
yes.
The role-playing game. So Torg just recently did a Kickstarter campaign, and then they're doing their backer stuff on Game on Tabletop. And Game on Tabletop is a full platform where they can do Kickstarter, they can do crowdfunding campaign and the backing part. So that's just new. That's a thing you could look into.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what about other surveys or alternatives? Why do you have to have a survey? How does that all work, and why do you choose who you choose for that? Does it matter?
I'm not sure what the survey you're talking about is.
So like you can do a survey in Kickstarter and say, what did you order, or did you ask for any additional stuff? Can you give me your address? Things like that.
Well, yes, when you want their money and their address, absolutely.
So you mentioned BackerKit as, I think, an alternative to that.
Yes.
Why would you use that over just a built-in survey in Kickstarter?
Well, I use BackerKit because, not so much the survey, because Kickstarter does have a survey function on it. BackerKit allows you to add on a store on the back end of your Kickstarter campaign. So I was able to have all of my stuff up so somebody who missed the campaign could go, oh, well, I can now pre-order it through BackerKit. And also, of course, the Kickstarter backers themselves could expand their order through BackerKit. So Kickstarter brought me about $50,000, I think, is what I got through Kickstarter. BackerKit dropped at about another $15,000 on top of that. Of course, they take their cut just like Kickstarter does, but that basically added about 25% to my intake on the whole campaign together.
Wow.
So
That's great.
Yeah.
So good option there, and probably also if you have. Did you sell your books on that as well?
no,
Okay.
I did do the edition through there, but I do have an independent site that it referred to, just wearingthecape.com, if they wanted to get my regular library.
Okay.
So
Cool. Let's move on to more crowdfunding of games in general. So, what are some? I mean, I think we've probably all seen successful crowdfunding attempts for games. What are some things that you've seen that have caused game crowdfunding attempts to fail?
do you mean before or after the campaign ends?
Ooh. Let's go
That's a
with
good
before
question.
first. Let's start with before. We'll come to after. I like that.
Okay, I did a lot of research into the RPG side of it before I launched my own, and your typical RPG game done through Kickstarter will probably, if they're amazingly successful, they'll net maybe $5,000 or $10,000, and that's because nobody knows who they are. And now I'm not talking about TSR or somebody else deciding to go through BackerKit, like who's the guy who Monty Cook? Who
Monty Cook
does
Games.
those huge RPGs, and
Numenera.
he's a known property, and he can do a $500,000 Kickstarter successfully, and he's done that several times. Nobody in this room is Monty Cook yet, and so if you go on Kickstarter, nobody's going to know who you are unless you got a built-in audience, and so you may have a niche out there that's interested in your particular game, but it's going to be a small niche. So half of the failures I've seen, they needed too much. And they just asked for too much and did not make that minimum happen. So that's right up front. You got to know how much to ask for.
Yeah.
Anything to add to that?
Going on the beforehand, you got to do your homework and have things set up before you ever even go on a Kickstarter. As a reviewer, one of the things I've seen that people haven't done is have some of the materials set up that they can get out there about their product. if someone contact, and I've had this happen a number of times now, I've got this game up, we're halfway through our Kickstarter, we're failing. Can you write a review for us? No. I mean, that's just a waste of my time. It's a waste of their time. It's failed. From things I've seen, most Kickstarter campaigns for games that I have seen any work with, they're usually fund within the first 2 days, or they don't fund. It's almost that drastic. All the other stuff is all the stretch goals going, but you got to have it set up like he's saying. Know what you need to ask for, and that needs to come up way before you ever go onto their platform.
I think what you're talking about is really, having a plan before you go in, having a product, having a clear idea what the product is, and that includes how are you going to actually make the product, how are you going to actually produce the product. I was just looking at this and I was thinking about, everything that goes into finding a printer and making sure that copy is good and making sure that looks good. So making sure you can actually make the product. And I think that goes into your question about afterward.
Yeah.
And then also making sure you get all your ducks in the row of thinking through, what is my marketing campaign? Am I going to advertise on Facebook and Instagram? Who are the influencers that I can reach out to? So like you, how do I get their buy-in? And then you'd imagine if they're a good influencer, they're going to need to have 1 to 3 months advance notice at least to be able to look at your game closely enough to provide a review or an interview or things like that.
Can I go on with
Yes.
the after?
Yeah, let's do that.
So like you're saying, lining up all this, one thing I've seen with working with board game designers that have done really well and those that have not done really well is if you're doing a board game, think of it more like you're taking pre-orders. You better have a product ready to move to production. If you're trying to say it's someone to finance you with a board game to do your true development and getting everything lined up, you're probably going to end up with a lot of pissed off people afterwards. Because I've seen it happen where it's all of a sudden they're 3 months out, 6 months out, 9 months out from the due date, and people lose faith in them. And they come back for the second time trying to do something, so people go, no, you've already lost it. So if you think about it like that, that's one of the big things I've seen different from when the people I've worked with in doing movies. They are looking for money to produce. And people know they're looking for money to produce, and it's going to be a year, 2 years, or 3 years out. You don't have that luxury in this part of it.
This book actually is exactly an illustration of what he said. This was all done, including 90% of the artwork even, before the Kickstarter launched. So within 2 or 3 months of the Kickstarter's end, this was being shipped to the backers. And they had the PDF for it only a couple of weeks after the Kickstarter was over. So for me, the Kickstarter wasn't about developing the product. It was about printing the sucker off and mailing it out. And it was also, of course, for spreading the word out there to the community that sees these games through Kickstarter. So for me, it was half marketing and half just moving it. So
I've seen that work very successfully with one person's a local. I don't know if anybody knows Tom Fowers. He's put out a couple of games through Kickstarter and raised huge amounts of money. And part of it, though, is off of his first one, he had his product going out to people within a month, and this was a boxed board game. And it was ready. I mean, he was taking pre-orders and had everything lined up before he ever hit Kickstarter. When he came out with the second one on a board game, he raised almost $500,000.
Wow.
So if you do that, how do you do your stretch goals then? If it's something that's almost basically ready to print off, or you can't really add in a ton of content or stuff like that.
And that's the bad story I had. This was the stretch goals. It finally shipped a month ago. My campaign ended in late 2016 or so. So I was not flamed by my backers because they knew up front that this was a work that was going to be completely developed off of the Kickstarter, and that since I'm a writer and this was a secondary thing, it was going to take time. So I did manage the expectations there, and I also sent out the first half of it as a PDF and then the second half of it as a PDF, and so I fed my people so they could see that it was coming out. But there, whenever you have a delayed fulfillment because you are doing production off the Kickstarter, you really have to manage the expectations. Otherwise, you're in for a world of hurt.
So have any of you ever seen a Kickstarter that maybe was successful, or maybe it wasn't, or so it had been going for a while, and sort of stalled out, and was jump started, right, to then become successful?
Nope, mine was his description. Funded in the first 2 days, and everything after that was over the funding level. So, but I will say that most Kickstarter campaigns do have usually they will have a spike at the beginning, and then you'll have a trough in the middle where you'll get some over the next 20 or 30 days, and then in the last half a week or so, you'll get another spike. So if that happens to you, don't panic. But I've never seen one that took off after just sitting there and flatlining for a week or two.
The only way I haven't seen it happen, but the only way I can think if you could get something like that to do is if you were waiting for someone to come out with some type of backing material and you launched, because that's when you're going for your launch or your starter, and then the backing material came out. But I have never seen anything that's when it was just not doing anything. I've never seen it recover.
I think one thing too is Kickstarter does have their features like, check out this game or whatever. So if you can get featured on there, or if you, people who again are influencers or something. So this has happened to my friend that he did a graphic novel series, and he got featured on the front page of Kickstarter, and he'd been doing pretty decently, and then all of a sudden it got featured on like, check out this project, and boom. But that was luck. I mean, it was a good product too, but
out of his control.
But out of his control.
But you did say he was already doing well with it,
Yes.
and that's one reason why they'll pick him up.
Yeah.
It's already a hot item. Check it out.
Yeah.
Something that with the spike toward the end that you mentioned. So a couple of things about RPG Kickstarters in particular that I've noticed is that often you can tell pretty close within like a multiplier of 2.5 to 3.5 times whatever you earn in the first day is what that campaign usually tends to earn overall. I don't know why that is, but that definitely seems to be the case. And two, you can look at metrics like I've seen the back end of Kickstarter tracks how many people star your campaign, and will give you that data, and they'll tell you how many of those people who starred the campaign have then converted to be a backer. And that percentage, like, it depends probably from company to company, but you can kind of gauge a little bit, because they give you that stat as you're going through the campaign, so you can kind of gauge a little bit and say, well, 7% of the people who've started my campaign have since backed. I can expect probably 21% of them, and so you can do some numbers and figure out that you'll probably get another, like in the case of Zorro, for example, right, we'll probably get another 200 backers based off of that by the end of the campaign, because the star notifies people the last 2 days of the campaign to come back and look at it, and then often a lot of those people will then back.
I've seen from talking to people on that is one of the reasons why that happens with the double hump is there's a lot of people go, oh, that looks interesting, but I want to make sure it backs before I back it.
Yeah.
They don't want to be putting money out there and then have nothing happen. And that's the reason why I think when it sees, if it doesn't, that second hump isn't usually going to push it over.
Yeah.
Cool. Let's talk about what specific, so I know that it seems like RPGs, you have some more experience watching tabletop.
Yeah, in some other areas.
So what specific problems can you run into with a board game versus an RPG?
Production. I think that's like you're saying, getting everything lined up. Board games have a lot of different levels. You're not just getting printing, you got to get your rule book printed, but developing a board, if you're doing that, is a different thing. Developing cards is a different thing. Developing your meeples is another aspect. Getting it all boxed together is an aspect. You got to have all those things kind of lined up beforehand with who's going to supply what and what can they win. I think that's a big difference.
And then assembling the product.
Yeah, putting it all together.
Best example that I ever saw was when I backed myself. Does anybody here, are you familiar with Tokaido? Is it board? Okay, you're nodding. How many backed the campaign a couple of years ago? No. Well, they're a very popular, with the name obviously it's a Japanese-oriented game, but it's a Euro game. And it's a very simple concept where you're a tourist on the Edo Road, going from Edo to Tokyo and collecting tchotchkes and meeting interesting people and so forth and eating interesting foods. And the idea is to have the best bragging rights for the most colorful pilgrimage when you get to the end. It went huge like 5 years ago. I mean, it was one of the most popular Euro games to come out. And they decided to do a deluxe edition. They did a huge Kickstarter. They got like $600,000 on it. Very successful Kickstarter. Then it blew up because one of the things was they were going to do some minis, little plastic minis of the pilgrims on the road. And sounds great in theory, but they had problem after problem after problem with their Chinese producers of the minis. And I think it took over 2 years for them to fulfill that campaign. And this is a professional company, so they've done board games. And they talking about flaming them. You go to their Kickstarter site and you will see so many flaming comments on that game, and they completely sank their Kickstarter reputation by that. So they eventually got it out, and it was really good, and I was very happy with the product. But 2.5 years, and so. Yeah, that's an epic story. You got to go look up.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I think production is probably the biggest difference between the two. Although RPGs can have stretch goals or pledge levels that have additional items like dice or things like that too that can, if you're not prepared to create whatever that thing is, if you haven't already prototyped it, right, then probably you shouldn't be adding it to your campaign because it can add a lot of time.
Dice are also, by the way, a very low profit thing,
right?
Because it costs, usually a custom die will cost you $3 or $4 per die, and you're not going to charge it in at more than $15 for a set of 4 or
Unless
something
you can
like
make
that.
a lot of them, yeah. Let's talk about. Well, you know what? Let's open it up. So, what questions do you all have? Raise your hand if you've got one.
So with the first 2 days being so important, once you get accepted for Kickstarter, I haven't looked into that part. Do you have time to market before you have a launch date? Do you get inside your launch date so that way you can get as much people to your order?
I would say you should be working on that as soon as you start thinking about you want to go social media or going into the social crowdfunding. You need to start building a plan. And I actually had a great conversation recently at a film festival with a guy that what he does is he helps people in crowdsourcing for movies. And he has over a 95% success rate. He's had one failure. And I actually wrote down some notes, just go along with that so that you can say, these are some things you should be doing as soon as you start thinking about it. You need a mailing list. You need to start telling people early on that you're planning on going this route. And that, try to get them involved in some of the things you want to do before you ever go up there. Set up social media. And Facebook has some real interesting things that he was pointing out. Like, if you put in a link, you'll get some traction. But if you write the whole article in Facebook and then share out from Facebook, Facebook will help push that to the top because it keeps them on Facebook. But if you have a link, you're kicking them off Facebook. They don't like to share that as much. So there's little things like that you need to learn. Get in the habit of being on there daily. Start promoting your product daily before it gets going so that as you lead up to when you're actually doing the launch, you already have this habit, you have people in run. Then you have to be very proactive on any issues that come up, make sure everybody knows. And if people know, they'll forgive you. But if you kind of forget to tell them, oh, we had a problem, and it's going to be a week late, that will drop some people right there, is that. So you have to be very proactive in building all that up beforehand. And the other thing he did is have a strategy team. don't try to do this completely on your own, even though that's a lot of reason why people say they want to do crowdsourcing is because they want the control. You need a team of people that will help push it out through the social media and other areas, so that when you put out that story on Facebook, you've got 10 people that immediately share it out for you. And that drives it up in the algorithms to the top.
As authors or anything that you do that you are doing on social media, you want to have a street team. I have a Facebook group that is my street team, and so when I put out my new book, I put out I'm gonna doing a sale or anything like that. And right now mostly it's like early readers, friends and family, but it's like, hey, can you share this? And those street team will be your most passionate followers that are like, oh my gosh, I can't wait for the next game or whatever. Get your fanboys and your fangirls in a group, in a mailing list, a Facebook group, and in that group, part of what you do is you say, hey, here's, I just released, here's the cover for, I'm recovering my books. Here's the cover for the first book. Nobody else has seen this yet on social media, and I'm going to share that with you a couple days in advance. So you're already providing that, hey, you're in the insider group, and then so they build that loyalty. So that way, that's the team that's going to be sharing it out. So you can start getting that viral effect of social media.
Another thing too is don't be afraid to start too early. I mentioned this earlier today in the other panel I was in. I have played games that were drawn on butcher paper, and the cards were regular playing cards with Sharpie writing on them. I mean, this is a person that they had a prototype and they were working through to start getting reviews and feedback from people that are out there, so that when you hit a Kickstarter campaign, you have references and say, here's what this person said about it. And that helps out a lot.
Well, I didn't think of it that methodically, but that's really actually what happened to me by accident. I started wearing the cape as a Facebook page years before the backer, so they saw all that news. When my research for this game took me into, I used the Fate system. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Fate. It's a open source license game because I didn't want to recreate the wheel to do a role playing game, and I had a lot of the people already deeply embedded in the Fate game test elements of my game, so they knew it was coming out. So it all worked out the same way. It really primed the pump that there was interest before the Kickstarter happened.
Mm-hmm. Great. And I can tell you these guys do the same thing with their game on Zorro. I knew Zorro was hitting Kickstarter a long time before it ever launched.
Yep. Who's next? Questions? What are you doing in 2 weeks?
I don't know.
SaltCon, Layton, Utah.
Okay.
It's 4 days of tabletop gaming. Starts Thursday, runs through Sunday. Last year they had just over 1,200 people there. I mean, that's the type of things you might start doing. When I went to SaltCon last year, I was meeting people from Canada, New York, Florida, Texas. One guy was down from Alaska, all showing off their games.
Sweet.
And you can do that. The other thing, too, is contests when you start getting to that point. One that's tied in with that one is the ION Awards. They have a bunch of different categories. That gives you some of the promo stuff to say, hey, I was a finalist. Then we're moving out to this point. But definitely find out. In Utah, you have that one in 2 weeks. In July is Salt Lake Gaming Convention. They do have a board game section. If they do it right again this year, SaltCon actually does several. I heard last year they were starting a gaming convention here in Utah Valley. There is the St. George Gaming Convention. There's Bryce Canyon Gaming Convention. There's Meeple Nation in Las Vegas. And there is the Idaho Gaming Convention. Those are all tabletopping.
Any other thoughts on that? How do you build an audience?
No, I'm going to take notes about this convention.
Yeah,
I'm going to get that list from you afterwards.
Yeah, that was a good list. And going back to just more, because I'm more of an author, but you still have to think about, like he was saying, where is your audience? How are you going to build buzz? How quickly can you get a prototype or product out and you could start testing it. Maybe you could start doing YouTube videos of you guys like, hey, we're testing out the game and here's what it is. You can do an Instagram of like, hey, here's the latest development, and so people can start following along as part of the process. A big thing, especially when you're independent, is making people who are early followers feel like they're part of that journey in helping you reach that bigger place. I think that creates a bigger ownership of the final product. And a bigger loyalty to you as an artist or creator, or whatever you consider yourself, and give yourself a title.
I'm going to steal a line from my wife, kind of. She was in, if everybody knows the movie, The Field of Dreams. My wife was in HR, and they always talked about how do you get people to come to an event at a business. And what they always came up with, and you can think of it the same way, feed them and they will come. Give them the information and they start coming along. They start looking for it.
Real food works too.
Yeah.
It's very true.
I mean, you could go on, is it Meetup?
Yep.
You can go on Meetup and you could do a test of your game and you can invite people to come and say, hey, we're going to take social media posts.
There is a number of like Dragon's Keep here and other game shops. If you talk to the local game shop around you and say, hey, I want to start doing this, they'll probably host you. I know Demolition Games in Salt Lake does a lot of that.
Yeah, and you can do it as a focus group so you get feedback on, is the gameplay working? Is there enough strategy? Is this too complicated? Is this turning into Cones of Dunshire? Or are we doing something simpler here?
I think
Cones of
everyone
what?
wants to make
Cones
Cones
of
of Dunshire.
Is there a story in this I got to know about?
You gotta watch Parks and Recreation.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
It's a good show and a great game.
I think I saw JC. Did you have a question?
No.
Okay.
Sorry.
In the back?
What's your opinion on allowing the crowd to influence ideas towards the game?
They're
a
your
great
market.
question.
It has to be handled delicately, because if you start to try to incorporate your crowdsourcing to influence your game, how is that going to change the game? And how long will it take to incorporate it? You know, if you should keep, like when we talked about developing a game before, and I know there's going to be stuff tomorrow on some of this, you need to have something that you can move with. If you're going out there and saying, hey, well, you can have this to influence, it could get rough. I think he was telling me earlier today about one thing he did, and that was selling character spots, like in a sense, where people were, he wrote up characters that these people now were in his books. That's one way, but if you're allowing them to change your game, it gets really touchy, because then it's, how is that going to impact the overall? Because you're the one that's been doing the play testing, not them.
I think you have to listen to your audience, but I think you also have to, like kind of like you were saying, you have to edit. So if you're getting, I think a good rule of thumb just with any sort of feedback is if you're getting consistently the same thing from multiple people, then then there's probably something you need to change. If you're getting it from one person, and especially one person who goes on and dictates exactly what it should be, they probably should go make their own game that matches that.
Now, my experience wasn't with game design since it was already designed, but what he was referring to was on the background as a not a stretch goal, but as one of the higher pledge levels. They could drop an extra $150 in it, and that most of that was to pay for the artist's illustration of the character, and then I would help them write up their character with the rules and help them work their background so the character fit in the universe, whether or not I ever used them canonically, but so they were a character of the world. And that was very successful, so it was kind of an invited buy-in. An unofficial one was on the expansion that I have. There's a whole chapter on Europe and the rest of the world. The main book was about America. The rest of the world I have no idea about. I mean, I read about it, but I accidentally brought in European backers who then told me whether or not my ideas for what happened in Europe or so forth, were like needed to be adjusted. So there was some interesting back and forth on the background on that.
I think if you're going to allow anything like that, then it has to be explicit and defined before your campaign, right? If you are In playtesting, by all means, right? Take feedback from your playtesters. That's what the purpose of that is. But if you're already doing a crowdfunding campaign, you should have been done with playtesting a long time ago, hopefully.
That should be over.
Yeah. Who's next? We got about 10 minutes.
Any advice on finding production? People that produce your games, your board games, people that avoid?
Advice on finding people to produce board games. So you have an idea for a board game and you want to have it
Made so that you can do before you do the crowdfunding or whatever.
So you're talking about like the manufacturing and that
Who
part
does
of
the
it,
card printing and the board printing?
right?
Find a successful campaign that's fulfilled and ask them who they used.
Yeah, it's a great
That's
idea.
just a
I was
place
gonna
to
say-
start.
Advice.
They will be happy to tell you.
There is actually, they've been running through some struggles here in Utah, but there is actually a game developing guild that was meeting on a regular basis through Salt Lake and several areas. And one person I know that will be happy to share information is Del Gifford. And Del Gifford is the owner of SaltCon. But there's also other people. I mean, if you usually go and talk to those people and sit down with developers and say, who are you using? You know, who have you heard about? They're really good about just sharing that information because it's you're going to be working together then.
Yeah, if you can find campaigns that were successful here in Utah, then you can probably pick someone's brain locally. But it's just as legitimate to do it over email or whatever. I'm sure people would be happy to give advice. If there's a campaign you like, you're like, man, they have the same type of components that I want to have for my campaign, and they were super successful, and they delivered on time. Well, that's the person you want to talk to.
Yep. That's a good point. Find someone that's doing something that you want to do. And if it has that's what you're looking for. Find out who they used. I think that's a great point.
More questions?
What are the major risks involved with crowdfunding a game?
Underestimating how much it's going to cost. That will sink you.
All shake your heads together.
That was a
yeah.
good
I was going to say
synchronization.
there's that, and how long will it take? I've seen where that's really killed people, where one person thought, oh, I have everything lined up. I'm going to do it in 3 months. That's tight, you know. And then, of course, what happened is he was sourcing stuff out of China. His container sat on the docks for 4 months. So you got to, money and time.
That's reputational risk there too, I think, right?
Yeah.
So you have reputational risk that if you don't deliver on time, then you may not be able to ever successfully fund another Kickstarter.
Yep.
But money is the one that will sink you. If you have to pay out of pocket to fund the thing that you crowdfunded, right? Because you didn't set your prices right, or you didn't have everything planned properly beforehand, that's a bad one. Like Soda Pop Minis, I think, is a good example of that out of Boise. So they had some huge, really big, successful miniature board game campaigns a couple years back with this little chibi miniatures. I don't know if you've seen any of those. Super Dungeon Explorer is a game that they crowdfunded, and there's a couple of others as well. But Super Dungeon Legends, I think, they went to Kickstarter like 3.5 years ago, and they still haven't fulfilled it, and they don't have the money to fulfill it, and they're going to end up going bankrupt over it, right?
Yeah.
So you got to watch out for that.
Yeah, we were discussing. I was asking him some questions about this, and one of the things do you want to kind of walk through like how much it costs to print, and then what the other costs are?
Well, this is a printer who will do small lots, and by small lots I mean lots of 1,000 is what I went with. I actually printed off way more than the Kickstarter needed because I wanted to get that economy of scale. At that level, this book cost me about $15 to print. So with shipping added from them to me to sign and distribute, I'm looking at another $10 per book. So technically, without shaving off the Kickstarter kickback and all that, taxes, I probably cleared about 50% profit per book. But then you throw in the Kickstarter and taxes. Really, when you do Kickstarter on the first one, you're not going to walk away with a big pile of money. That's not the whole point of Kickstarter. The whole point of Kickstarter is to finish a good product, establish a reputation, and like you said, the next Kickstarter you do, if you have a bunch of satisfied people from the first one, it's going to get bigger, and you just keep on building on that. So
Maybe we should talk about the fees and things involved from Kickstarter really quickly, just in case. Does everybody already know how fees and Kickstarter work? A couple of you do. Let's talk about that real fast.
it's been 2.5 years. I don't even remember what the numbers are.
Okay. Well, I think I do.
But yeah, go ahead. You're
okay.
probably better at this part than I am now.
So Kickstarter charges 5% off the top, right? And I think they charge 5% for credit card fees, right? And then if you use an external backer supplier, like what you mentioned, like BackerKit, right? Anything you sell through BackerKit, they're going to charge you another 5%. And then any add-ons or anything like that you do through there, I think they charge you like 2% right off the top as well of your whole Kickstarter just to use them.
They give you a couple of choices, so that if you're a small backer, if you're a small customer, then there's an option. If you're a bigger customer, there's an option. So it really depends.
Okay. JC.
So in, you talked about how you need to have a team. I guess, how do you decide what elements you aren't able to handle yourself, and how do you pick your team? Because you're going to need to be able to rely on them, because you can be a writer but not a graphic designer and stuff like that.
I guess it comes back to have them do it first. so you're not going to get let down by your team. It's obviously easier when you're printing a book than when you're doing a game, because you have more moving parts.
I think you answered your own question. You find your weaknesses.
Right.
No, I mean, seriously, you find your weaknesses, and then you find the people to fill those weaknesses on that development.
And have them do test work, right? Basically.
Yeah.
So have
Make
them,
sure-
if you want to use an editor, then have them edit a small piece of your work and see how good their quality is, right? If you want to use a graphic designer, make them build you a logo for $150, and then if you like that, then maybe you'll like their page layouts, right?
Ask for references.
Yes, that too.
Definitely ask for references.
Is trying to how to phrase it. So when you're building a team, right, and if you're really tight on cash, how successful have you been, or do you, on trying to find people who are also dedicated to the product and willing to put in time in exchange for capital later, or do you rely primarily on funding out of pocket at the beginning for services?
That's a tough one. Being on the end where the people go, hey, you know what? If you'll edit my rule book, I'll include you in. Yeah, really? That's a tough one, because most of the time as the person being given that offer, you don't see anything ever really come of it. So the other part, but if you find some dedicated people, a lot of that will come together. In terms of the team, there's two different teams. I was talking about earlier about a team to get the Kickstarter campaign up and running. And what you guys are kind of talking about now is actually the development of the game. So there's kind of a difference there. So you have to be willing to probably invest some money beforehand in terms of getting your graphic design work done and all that.
All of the art in this was paid for before the Kickstarter happened. And we're talking about $100 per image or more sometimes. So yes, that's a big issue.
I don't think there's any way around having some outlay beforehand, but there are hybrid models where you can pay some and then offer some percentage of Kickstarter or percentage of later sales, right? There are some ways to do it, but I think unless you find the equivalent of a business partner, you're not going to find anyone who's willing to just say, yeah, I'll take 5% of your Kickstarter net in order to,
I would
do all these things for you.
Yeah, as doing some editing for some of that, the only way I would do that is if I know they have a standing reputation, that I know, I've met Alan Barr and worked with him with Gallon Night Games. If he comes up to me and says, hey, I need this work done, can you? Yeah, because I know he's going to be good for it. But if I've got someone that's contacting me with email or something like that I've never really heard of from before, or maybe I've seen one thing from him, probably not.
Being able to find that team, being able to procure funds to support the team, it's all under the assumption that you are wanting to start your own team. How feasible is it for someone to try to approach another team that is building tabletop and say, hey, I can contribute a small portion or however to what you are working on right now.
That actually happens quite a bit from what I've seen.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, where somebody's, they're kind of working on something, you'll see them, I've seen it at conventions where people are working on something, they'll come up and say, hey, you know, if you try this and this, and they start talking, and pretty soon you see that next convention, they're collaborating.
Okay.
I mean, if you're showing an interest in what they're doing, and you're willing to put in that effort and work with them, yeah. I mean, how would you feel if someone came up to you and said, hey, I like what you're doing, and I can help you do this part?
I'd say I don't have money.
But then all of a sudden, but still, they can, you can start that collaboration.
And then I think we'll have to wrap.
I gotta say, I really did not build a pre-production team a production team other than my family.
Family's great.
Yes, family is wonderful, and Mormons have big families, so. We have a natural resource to tap, yes.
I mean, this is with self-publishing, but it's a similar thing. So the covers for these two books, part of what I'm doing a rebrand. My sister's a professional graphic designer, so she did the covers for my first two books for free. I just paid for the stock photos, so it cost me like $50 for both books to do it. Now that I have what I would call a grown-up job, where I actually make enough money that I can invest it back into things, I hired a cover artist, and I'm working on rebranding it with a higher-end cover, so that way I can do that. And so sometimes you just got to go with iterations of like, this is the one to get me started, and I'm gonna, you know, barter with this friend and talk to this family member and go on Fiverr and get this. And then once you're more established and you're building a reputation and you've got a little more money to invest, then you do that. How do I make that even more professional? You want a professional base, but then you want to build to, how can I make this even more polished, even more professional? Make version 2.0 or make a new game or whatever it is.
So we're out of time, but I'm going to have everybody just really quickly, if you have a future crowdfunding effort that you'd like to pitch, tell us about that real quick.
I don't have any, but personally, I work with people. I have cards up here if you want to grab them, of how to reach me, and reach Guildmaster Game.
I have nothing scheduled, but I do have a sort of a sequel to this as a planning stage, where I'm taking it and making it more universal than just a superhero world. So next year or two.
So I've talked about it. So what I'm looking at right now and I'm doing a lot of research into is, do I want to do crowdfunding to do the rebrand of my book, to kind of launch that next phase of, here's the first 3 books packaged together, new covers, look how shiny this is. So that's kind of what I'm researching. What?
In a box.
In a box.
Yes. Cool. And I have, no, actually, that's already crowdfunding. So I have a future game called Arium, which is a world-building RPG, and if anybody's interested in playtesting it, I will be playtesting it here probably most of the day tomorrow.
Nice.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Boom.